Hello, everyone, and welcome to the remote launch of the Elgar Encyclopedia of Climate Policy. I am Dan Fiorino, and I teach in the School of Public Affairs at American University and direct the Center for Environmental Policy. The Elgar Encyclopedia of Climate Policy is a result of at least 2 years of work. It reflects the contributions of about 100 different authors from around the world who have together authored 89 articles that make up the encyclopedia, as well as an introduction that provides an overview of the issue of climate change. The idea is to bring together in one book a fairly exhaustive treatment of many of the different policy issues and policy options and policy tools associated with both climate mitigation and adaptation. And so we think this provides an excellent resource for scholars, students, practitioners, and others interested in understanding the different ways of dealing with climate change, which increasingly we speak of as a climate crisis. So I think the book really serves that purpose very well. My fellow co-editors, both of whom will be speaking today, are Manjot Kaur Ahluwalia, formerly of the University of Maryland and American University, and now with the Asia coordinator with the Global Methane Hub, and Todd Eisenstadt, who is a professor of government at American University. And we have today authors from 5 different chapters in the encyclopedia. Dorit Carrot from Tel Aviv University, speaking about positive psychology and climate policy. Jens Marquardt from the Technical University of Darmstadt, speaking about populism and the implications for climate policy. Terry Yossi, sustainability advisor and former CEO of the World Environment Center, who will be speaking on corporate behavior with respect to climate policy. Ilaria Espa of the Italian University of Switzerland and the World Trade Institute, who will be speaking about border carbon adjustment, which is getting a lot of attention these days. And Christo Filima of the University of Kentucky, who will be speaking on a case study she did on small island states. So I think we have an interesting program. I hope you'll consider using the encyclopedia in your classes and in your research. With that, I will turn this over to Manjot Kaur Ahluwalia, who will speak generally about the organization and purpose of the encyclopedia. Manjot?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for tuning in. I am really thrilled to be here and share the floor with the authors here, as well as with my fellow editors. Also, I think, Dan, thank you for a great introduction. I think you highlighted the vision that we have for the encyclopedia, and I think given the urgency and importance of acting on climate, it was important for us to make this as accessible to everyone because there is so much intersectionality across disciplines. So the aim was not, I was a student not too long ago, so making it accessible for students, academics, policymakers, practitioners, as Dan noted, and those who are just getting interested in this important topic. And I think there's something for everyone at different stages of their climate policy journey. And there are about 90 entries divided into 6 parts with the key elements and topics such as theories, methods, cross-cutting issues. These start with the very fundamental concepts to understanding climate policy, including some of the more theoretical concepts such as distributive politics, carbon pricing, financial risk disclosure, cross-cutting topics such as political regimes, populism, behavioral economics, gender, some of which you'll hear, some of the authors will speak about this. Then we move on to evidence and impacts, because there has been, of course, an evolution of the scientific understanding of climate change. So this is divided into physical impacts such as extreme weather, sea level rise, the Arctic, etc., as well as the impact of this on human population, be it migration, health, environmental justice, and other issues. Then it was very important for us to highlight the actors, institutions, and agreements that form really the basis of policy making. And not just the institutions, but the collaboration across actors across different levels, as well as global diplomacy, such as the UNFCCC, Paris Agreement. These are, the landmark agreements in the climate world, Montreal Protocol, as well as different actors, not just governmental, but non-governmental, such as corporate actors, for example, and other subnational actors. And then it's also very important not just to spell out the problem, but the solutions. So we did try to offer some policies and technologies that can help address the challenge, such as just energy transition, international trade policy, the US Inflation Reduction Act, disaster risk management, methane reduction, green hydrogen, among others. And then there were some key concepts that do not neatly fit in all those categories. So you would read about greenhouse gas and other pollutants, the concept of net zero emissions, climate migration, public opinion, loss and damage. And then last but not the least, it's also important to show how these different concepts land and get applied in countries, as well as in subnational governments, such as different states and municipalities. And these also highlight not just the issue, but also the political regimes that determine and shape the context, as well as the innovations and solutions that have been used to tackle the problem. So we do cover highest emitters of greenhouse gases, US, China, India, Brazil, the EU, and some of the vulnerable populations and countries such as the small island states that you'll hear about. And of course, subnational entities, some of the leading ones such as California, and some other examples of South African municipalities, among others, and some of the laggards too, as you may hear about. So I think with this, I would give the floor back to Dan, and I hope this gives you an interesting flavor of what the book offers. And Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Manjot. So now what we're going to move into some short presentations by 5 of the authors of different articles in the Encyclopedia. And we're going to begin with Dorit Carrot. Dorit is with Tel Aviv University and has been doing a lot of work on positive psychology and sustainability, and wrote an article on positive psychology and climate policy. And I should just note that in some of the promotional materials for this event, the title was given as the Elgar Encyclopedia of Climate Change. It's the Encyclopedia of Climate Policy. So it really focuses on sort of understanding the context for public policy and a number of the policy options that are available. So Dorit, I will turn this over to you.
So thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. Imagine waking up every day with a sense of purpose, knowing that your actions contribute to a healthier planet and a happier community. This is the promise of integrating positive psychology into climate policy. I'm honored to be a part of this invaluable resource for anyone seeking rigorous yet concise knowledge in the field of climate policy and politics. Today, I will speak with you about the powerful intersection of positive psychology and climate policy. As we face the most complex challenge humanity has ever encountered, climate change, I would like to assert that it is still all about humans. Therefore, we must better understand how to engage them in both mitigation and adaptation while preserving their mental health. On a personal note, I say still because, as we all know, we're on the verge of a new AI era that might also solve many human problems, but this is yet to be determined. For now, when I was preparing for my talk, I was considering using AI to write it for me, though I was upset it might take all the fun out of it. To cut the long story short, I ended up using my own talk, although I must say its capabilities are impressive. This brings me back to my claim that it is still all about humans, which is why it is imperative that we gain insights into human behavior and implement them in policy. While policies are essential, they're ultimately the product of human choices and require individual collaboration. Individual actions influence public spheres through community actions, political activities, and changes in social norms. Understanding human behavior is paramount in addressing climate change. So why positive psychology? Positive psychology is sometimes misperceived as the happily ever after science, but it couldn't be further from that. It is more the resilience or anti-fragility science, understanding how to face difficulties and not break down. It's about when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. How to use insights from positive psychology to engage policymakers to become creative, to face and prevent new mental illnesses such as climate depression or climate anxiety. How do we engage every human being to think, to act, and to influence their largest circle of influence and keep going? And how do we make these actions sustainable? Three main contributions of positive psychology to these questions are: it offers a direct approach, asking what do we want instead of what don't we want. It gives us some hints about the resources needed to do all that. It proposes that our own well-being is well entangled with our relationships, with nature, with other people, and with our actions and meaning. Positive psychology advocates for a direct approach to promoting valuable outcomes. An example from the natural world would be, if we want to grow tomatoes and we take out all the wild weeds, will we have tomatoes growing? Of course not, as we have to plant tomato seeds in the ground first. Or if we take an example from the real world, in my country, water is scarce. My pets love it when it rains. Yet, for many years, stormwater was treated as an environmental hazard, causing floods and polluting the sea. Until the planning approach changed to treat it also as a resource, feeding winter pools, providing nature with water, and using it for greywater. This is an example of the difference between an indirect approach, treating the hazard, and a direct approach, considering it as a resource. So in sum, the direct approach means constantly promoting policies and action for perpetual improvement rather than merely reacting to crises. Positive psychology offers many skills that can be developed through relevant policies and educational systems, and I will mention a few examples. Hope is a vital variable that promotes subjective well-being and pro-environmental behavior. Our definition is based on goal-oriented hope, focusing on achievable goals, developing various paths for achieving them, overcoming obstacles, developing agency thinking, the belief that you can achieve these goals, and fostering trust in others. Education and policies can instill hope in individuals and communities, empowering them to take meaningful action and retain their mental health. Identifying and acting through our strength foster better motivation for action, leading to better outcomes and increased well-being. Insights from motivational studies can help sustain behavior over time and prevent burnout, particularly among climate activists. Craft better policies. Promoting nature connectedness can help individuals cope with negative emotions regarding climate change and inspire constructive hope and action. Mindfulness serves as a resource for coping, resilience, and climate adaptation. Developing mindfulness through various practices can enhance your ability to respond thoughtfully and creatively to climate challenges while promoting our own well-being. These skills are particularly essential today in the technological generation when we spend less time in nature and more in a multitasking environment. So as we conclude, there is a major convergence between well-being and environmental outcomes. Policies should internalize insights from behavioral sciences, making environmental behavior pleasurable and convenient. On a personal note, in Israel, our population is a major issue, burdening natural resources, and yet the social norm, even within the liberal atheist population, is to have 3 children. So I will end with a personal story regarding this aspect. I have 2 kids. My older daughter is called Mayan, and my younger is Aviv. Once, when their headmaster and linguistic asked me, "When are you gonna have the 3rd one?" I answered, "You know, Mayan translates to water spring and Aviv to spring the season. Would you like me to call the 3rd one Fifth, which is the last translation of the word spring?" With positive psychology, we can direct climate policy to change behavior, motivate people and public policymakers, make more effective policies, and change social norms. Together, we can harness the power of positive psychology to not only address climate crisis, but to build a world where well-being and sustainability go hand in hand. Thank you, and then I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Dorit. It's really a fascinating topic, and I'm very glad that we could include that in the encyclopedia. Next, I would like to introduce Jens Marquardt. Jens is with the Technical University of Darmstadt and has co-edited a special issue of the journal Environmental Politics on populism and climate policy. So I think he is an excellent person to speak about this very important topic. So Jens, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. And whoops, multitasking, let's see. Okay, thanks, Dan, and also thanks, Manjit and Todd and all the others for making this possible and for creating such a great collection. I'm not trying to think how to come from positive psychology to populism, but yeah, let's give this a try. It's a little bit disruptive here, but what you see here is actually a fair representation of populism. So, well, Donald Trump, as you all know them. But what I would like to do in the next 6 minutes or so is to stress that populism is not only about making ridiculous claims and promoting outright climate change denial. Instead, populism can also have quite some positive implications for democracy, although it sounds a bit weird. But I would argue that instead of blaming populism as a threat to climate politics, we could also reframe it and should also reframe it as a wake-up call for thinking about democracy and democratic climate politics in general. And to do this, I would like to briefly explain and introduce 3 propositions I would like to make here. First is that the term populism encapsulates very different meanings. So we're playing around with the term that means different things to different people. Second is that climate populism is neither bad nor good, but it can be both in very extreme ways. And finally, that, as I said, populism calls for new modes and new functions of democracy. So to start with first, populism in general is a highly contested term. And some would even say, well, it has become so arbitrary that it has no meaningful analytical purpose. But others embrace the term for its actually multiple meanings and its plurality. And at its core, populism, is quite simple. So it has 3 core components. There is somehow it constituted by the people as a unified but exclusive entity against a somehow defined elite, or the corrupt elite, or the establishment, how populists would call it. And there is a fundamental struggle between the two groups. Now, to analyze populism, we can distinguish between, or scholars distinguish between, 4 different dimensions or 4 different categories of populism, namely ideology, strategy, discourse, and political logic. And I start with discourse because this is normally what we first think about when thinking about populism, that discourse defined here as Benjamin Moffat coins it as a particular mode of political expression, usually evident in speech and text. So this is central to the everyday usage of the term populism. But populist discourses often work independently from a normative political program or a set of ideology. And so does strategy. So the strategy of populism stresses how populist leaders and also organizations direct and mobilize the people and how they pursue political power. And here again, populism is not defined by a leader's norms and values, but rather by the direct relation with the people, so with the people he wants to address and the followers of him or her. In terms of ideology, it's getting interesting because populism is not a full-fledged ideology, as Kasmude and others would conceptualize. Instead, it's a thin-centered ideology that needs to incorporate ideas and meanings of thicker ideologies such as socialism or communism or nationalism, fascism, etc. So it borrows from other and often extreme ideologies. And finally, Ernest Laclau and Mouffe would propose populism actually as the political logic, or the logic of the politics that becomes the kind of structuring logic of political life and establish the divide between 2 competing antagonistic groups, the people and the elite. And so if people are the subject of politics, then populism in that logic is the logic of the political. Now, as Stella already mentioned, so there was an issue well, there is a link, obviously, between populism and politicization. And populism obviously depends on politicization, and which is intrinsically linked to populism. And so we understand politicization here as the emergence of political conflicts that become more intense, more visible, and include ever more actors. And what this means when we look at populists and how they frame their political agendas is in the climate field, there is an ever-going conflict or tension between modes of politicization on the one side and depoliticization on the other side. And Yves Pepermas and Peter Massele once summarized very nicely this tension with a distinction between a consensus-building perspective and a critical debate perspective. That means that proponents of a consensus-building perspective argue that politicizing climate change can hinder climate action. So this is the rationale, science-based, evidence-based climate policy making is important, and any kind of political disruption would hinder good climate policies. Whereas in contrast, the critical debate perspective would argue this is exactly the problem we have with climate policy making: the lack of conflict, the lack of contestation, the lack of debate and deliberation about what is good and bad. And these proponents of the critical perspective would also call for more active politicization of the issue and enhance the democratic debates and engage with affected groups related to climate politics. The third point I would like to raise here is that populism in climate politics can enhance authoritarianism, but also democratize climate change debate. So both left and right-wing populists politicize climate change by pointing at the social tensions arising from the climate crisis. For example, you see a left-wing populist highlighting that tackling the climate crisis means mobilizing the poor and protecting the most vulnerable. This can be coastal communities, indigenous people, working class families, etc. But also right-wing populists, most famously like Trump's coalition with coal workers or the fossil fuel industries. They also align with vulnerable, with poor, with the so-called marginalized or the forgotten people in the democracy. So environmental populism, particularly in Latin America, highlights the need to engage with affected and often marginalized people, which means it can potentially also democratize climate politics. So finally, the reason for how we respond to populism, I would argue, is important and requires to rethink democracy as we know it. First, populism can lead to more authoritarian tendencies. I think this is quite clear, and we've seen it in various examples all over the world from democratic and autocratic leaders as well. If populists change the rules of the game in liberal and constitutional democracies, this could eventually lead to an authoritarian system or authoritarian responses to climate change, either in terms of denial or in very restrictive measures. But then there's also the other side, that populism historically has been associated with a broadening of democracy. For example, Laura Grattan describes that anti-capitalism grassroots movements show that populism can democratize societies and, quote, create spaces for new visions and practices of democracy. So populism can be an emancipatory force for democracy, enacting the sovereignty of the people. And well, there's a third opinion always in political science. It always depends. Like scholars like Muffet argue that the effects of populisms deeply depend on historical, cultural, socioeconomic context. So we thus need a deeper understanding of these contexts. So I highlighted here already that thinking about populism in this way would mean to see it as a wake-up call for more democracy or different kinds of deliberative democracy. And what actually worked surprisingly well, but has not come over or beyond the experimental status, are democratic mini-publics or climate citizens assemblies as a reaction also to populists. Because populists can polarize and radicalize societies, they can fuel anti-democratic sentiments, yet populist interventions are not necessarily anti-democratic. They can help illuminate the democratic deficits of political decision-making and bring issues to the fore that are otherwise neglected. And of course, populists can fuel eco-authoritarianism and climate change denial, but both could re-establish anti-democratic institutions, all in the name of the people. So populism can enable radical democratization. And Amanda Machin once said that disagreement over climate change provides an opportunity to develop alternatives, disrupt business as usual policymaking, and foster civic participation. Yet I would say that liberal democracies lack the political institutions or the institutional framework to deal with climate populism and these complex societal conflicts we see. What you see here in the pictures is that forms of deliberative democracy, such as the climate citizens assemblies, have worked surprisingly well to overcome polarization and even bridge societal divides. So bringing completely different, randomly selected people in a room and let them talk and let them speak leads to surprising results in terms of finding consensus and even developing very, very progressive climate policies that some governments, like in Ireland, take up and others, like in France, water down. So we see there's a potential to respond to populism in a very, I just say, progressive way, but this needs to rethink also our democratic institution and critically reflect about these institutions. Sorry. And with this, I conclude and give it back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Jens. This is clearly an important topic, the politics of climate change generally, and the effects of populism in particular are, I think, very important issues. So thank you for that presentation. Next, Terry Yossi will be speaking. Terry has worked with a number of private sector organizations on a range of sustainability issues, including climate policy, and has written an essay for the Encyclopedia on corporate behavior and climate change. So Terry.
Thank you, Dan. And it's great to be with everybody today. In preparing my essay, I wanted to address a question that I think is still vexing to many people, but also relevant on a daily basis. And that is, why are corporations such reluctant participants in responding to climate change? And in order to organize my analysis, I focused on two overarching questions. One has to do with how does responsibility for addressing climate change fit within a company's defined business and social purpose? And secondly, how does responding to climate change impact the way in which a company makes its money? So I will address each of these two questions in sequence. As to the question of business and social purpose, this has been a topic that has been debated, discussed, accepted in not only the academic literature, but the popular literature in many business journals, newspapers for many, many decades. Perhaps the most famous early comment on business and social purpose was provided by the world's most famous management strategist, Peter Drucker, in his textbook called The Practice of Management, published in 1954, in which Drucker very clearly, very powerfully stated that the purpose of a business was simply to create a customer. And that point of view was very influential for many, many decades thereafter, until it was superseded, I believe, by a statement from an economist at the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman, who in a very famous article in 1970 in the New York Times Magazine wrote a piece, and the power of the argument is captured in the title of the piece. It's much more ideological, it's much narrower than how Drucker was thinking. But Friedman's point of view was social responsibility of business is to increase profits. Now, neither Drucker nor Friedman had much interest or room in their analysis for issues like the social purpose of business as we understand it today, or environmental protection. In their view, issues like environmental protection was an artifact of government requirements, and beyond philanthropical contributions, beyond complying with government regulations, business ought to stick to its knitting of building customers and making more money for its shareholders. Both Drucker and Friedman had legions of adherents, of apostles, if you will, disciples. One of the foremost was at Harvard for many years. In fact, he just passed away several months ago, Michael Jensen, who was one of the big proponents of this idea of shareholder value that is much debated. And not only at Harvard, University of Chicago, but business schools around the country, around the world, this notion of managing for profit, managing for shareholder value, became the entrenched ideology, became the prevailing view on Wall Street and in the CEO suite of executive management. And so when an issue like climate change becomes prominent as a public policy matter, CEOs and financial analysts already have a ready-made ideology to either marginalize it or dismiss climate change, and that is, it doesn't fit with the accepted ideology of building shareholder value or making money. That debate has been rejoined in recent years by Mariana Mazzucato, by Kate Rayworth, and most recently by Stu Hart at the University of Michigan. But so far, the Wall Street CEO point of view linked around shareholder value and profitability is still the predominant view in capital markets. The second question that I wanted to analyze to look at corporations' reluctance to engage in climate change has to do with how corporations make their money. I think there is generally a broad acceptance that profitability is a valued outcome of business activity. It benefits employees, shareholders, provides capital to invest in innovation, including environmental improvements, and obviously provides funding for tax revenues. But I think we need to drill a little deeper here to understand how companies make their money. And I think a key to that learning lies in an examination of something called the business model. Now, that is often referred to. A business model is nothing more complicated than a series of assumptions, operational practices, all intended to optimize revenue, develop new products and services, build customer relationships, and capture value. The assumption has been that business models will be very stable over time and will last a long time. That assumption is increasingly challenged by global megatrends, technological innovation, and newer innovations from competing businesses. I think some good examples of this challenge to existing business models occurs through such things as how the global COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the businesses of the airline, the hospitality, the entertainment, sports sectors. We see the 100+ alliance between the automobile industry and the petroleum industry is now increasingly fraying, because for over 120 years, those two industries have been joined at the hip in mutual dependence, in that the internal combustion engine required motor fuels. Now we're seeing the automobile industry veering away from that traditional internal combustion engine business model into exploring other alternatives, whether powered by electricity, hydrogen, or other alternatives. Meanwhile, the petroleum industry is digging in with more assertiveness in preserving its existing business model as long as possible. And there are other experiments that are going on in other industries that yield some insight. The chemical industry, for example, is engaged in a series of investments to look at whether there are non-fossil fuel alternatives to making plastics. The US government is laying the groundwork for new or adapted business model through the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, whereas the US government is funding it with enormous levels of investment, modular nuclear activities, hydrogen fuels, et cetera. So keep watching that space of business models, because it's bound to be increasingly dynamic. I want to close with a couple of observations. First, whether it's on the purpose of business or the business model connected to how companies make their money, I would say that most of these decisions have not been driven by climate change. If they were, we would already be examining why we would be expanding semiconductor manufacturing operations in Arizona, where water resources are extremely scarce, or why the chemical industry would continue to expand its operations in the Gulf of Mexico, where the waters are warming and subject to increasingly disruptive hurricanes and storms and floods. I want to close with a couple of comments on corporate leadership and its values. One of the interesting developments that's been happening in more recent years, according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers analysis, is that the average tenure of being a CEO continues to decline. I think the median tenure in a recent survey was about 5 years and declining. That's not a very long time for any CEO to implement more fundamental changes in direction and scale of a company. I would argue that very few CEOs aspire to implementing transformational change. Above all else, corporate leaders they value continuity, they value the ability to deliver financial performance, retain key customers and talent, and maintain stability to execute the business plans. Both historically and currently, business leaders were not developed to manage disruptive change, particularly change coming from demographic and values changes in society. And we see ample evidence of that and how ineffectively so many companies have responded to the environment's societal and governance debates, and how inept some of the company's performance has been on that topic. So I think we have a long way to go yet in terms of preparing CEOs and executive leaders to understand how to manage disruptive change. We're going to be seeing more disruptive change. So Dan, as I hand it back to you, I would just advise everybody in our listening audience to keep their seatbelts fastened, because our interesting ride has just begun.
Very good. Thank you very much, Terry. I think listeners are getting an idea of the range of topics that are addressed in the Encyclopedia of Climate Policy: positive psychology, populism, corporate behavior. I just want to mention that we will have some time to take questions from the audience at the end of the session. So you can use the question and answer function to pose questions as they occur, and we will do our best to respond to those at the end of the program. The encyclopedia deals with a range of topics, including specific policy tools or policy instruments. One that has been drawing a lot of attention in the last few years is border carbon adjustment. And we have an expert on this topic, Ilaria Espa, who is with the Italian University of Switzerland and the World Trade Institute. So Ilaria, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me here and for letting me participate in this great project. I'm really honored. So as you mentioned, my contribution is on border carbon adjustments, or BCAs as they're called, and basically explains the logic behind BCAs, the normative justification for the use of BCAs, but also makes a fundamental point. That is, BCAs are fundamentally unilateral trade and climate measures of a new experimental nature. And because of that, their status under international trade law, but I would also argue under international climate law, is at best uncertain. And that is the reason why they're creating a lot of geopolitical tensions at the time being. So what are BCAs and what is the context for thinking about implementing a BCA? So the context is certainly the heterogeneity in climate policies that has been led by the bottom-up approach to the Paris Agreement, which, as we all know, is informed by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, which has been leading to very uneven carbon prices, both explicit and implicit, with only a subset of countries that are actually implementing carbon pricing mechanisms such as carbon taxes and emission trading schemes. This has caused concerns regarding potential carbon leakage risks for carbon-intensive trade-exposed sectors covered under such schemes due to the allegedly unfair competition that operators covered and subject to such carbon pricing mechanisms would face from non-carbon constrained producers not exposed to comparable carbon prices in their country of origin. Now, against this backdrop, ambitious countries have basically two options. And so far, the first option has never been used, for instance, by the EU, which has, by the way, recently approved its so-called CBAM or BCA scheme. And first option would be to resort to measures domestically that level down carbon prices for those operators that would otherwise be subject to a higher carbon constraint and therefore higher carbon price as compared to the other international competitors. For instance, in the EU, this has been done by allocating allowances for free under the emission trading scheme, but you can also think of partial or total exemptions to the carbon tax, for instance, for those countries that have explicit carbon taxes. Another and arguably better climate alternative would, however, be to actually resort to BCAs, that is, to trade instruments for the purposes to equalize carbon prices and therefore level the playing field at the border. Now, these instruments have mostly been discussed on the import side, meaning that BCAs would be used to extend the carbon domestic price to imports, but you can also think of adjusting on the export side, meaning rebating the domestic carbon price on exports. Now, in this way, you level the playing field, but you also serve another set of goals that are related, right? BCAs are basically fair competition tools, they are political leveraging tools, but these fits within an overarching logic of trying to mitigate carbon leakage risks. Now, what is the problem? Very briefly, the problem is that contrary to border tax adjustments, whose legality under international trade law has long been accepted, BCAs are very contentious, especially when they're linked to complex emission trading schemes, which are very technically and administratively difficult to implement and to adjust at the border. And one example is the EU CBAM, which is meant to mirror the EU ETS, but we see that from a practical perspective presents many challenges for how you calculate and verify the carbon that's embedded into covered imports, to how you determine default values, to how you adjust overseas carbon prices, etc., just to mention a few. So this leads me to the main point, which is that we are not exactly sure how these measures would fare under World Trade Organization rules. They're very likely to be challenged, and they're very likely to not be fully compatible with non-discrimination principles, in particular, the national treatment principle and the most favored nation clause. On the one hand, because they could be discriminating against foreign products, because under current rules and the current interpretation of the existing rules, products with different carbon intensities could be considered to be like products in WTO jargon, because of course, carbon is incorporated into the products, but it's a non-product related process methods that does not really affect the physical properties of goods. And on the other hand, on the most favored nation side, the CBAMs are normally thought as to being applied only with respect to imports coming from countries that do not have a similar carbon pricing scheme. So there are exclusion features, so to call them, to partially or fully exclude imports coming from certain countries from the scope of application of the scheme. Now, the big question is, can BCAs be justified under the exceptions we have under WTO law, in particular, the ones that look at environmental rationales as a potential shelter for measures that could be discriminatory? The question again is open, in particular when it comes to the so-called chapeau requirements, which require that the measures be applied in a way that would not constitute arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, in particular because at least the schemes that we know more about, and in particular the UCBAM, only credit for explicit carbon pricing and therefore do not recognize implicit prices, irrespective of the fact that the Paris Agreement explicitly allows for heterogeneity of approaches in dealing with climate action. In light of this, in my piece, I identified a number of areas where I would argue policy research should be strengthened in order to identify design of BCAs that could not only be WTO approved, but also Paris aligned. And a few of those are, for instance, a better calibration of the exclusion features that I've just discussed to accommodate better for the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities as recognized under the Paris Agreement, using revenues from BCAs to promote the decarbonization efforts of those countries that have a special status under the Paris Agreement, such as least developed countries, small island development states, but also the usage of carbon clubs discussions to accelerate and expand efforts towards international cooperation on carbon pricing. So I would leave it there and would give it back the floor to you then. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Ilaria. I like the point you mentioned early on, where border carbon adjustment is climate policy and it's trade policy. And I think that's a challenging intersection, but certainly with lots of potential. So we also have an article on international trade policy and climate by Dan Estes. So one could read that and then read your article and get more in terms of current practical solutions. So thank you. Our final chapter presenter is Crystal Belima of the University of Kentucky. Crystal actually contributed 2 articles to the Encyclopedia, one on disaster risk management and the other on small island states. So we thought small island states would be a really interesting topic to highlight in the program today. So I will turn this over to Crystal.
All right, thank you, Dan. Hi, everyone. So my case study here, small island states, I'm looking at various regions that are considered to be a part of what the UN has recognized as SIDS, Small Island Developing States, which is located across 3 different geographical regions: the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. In 1992, the UN classified SIDS as a special case for social, economic, environmental development. And through this particular entry, I highlighted how small island states, they vary in topographies, cultures, histories, economies, political systems, and population demographics. And most importantly, that they also share similarities that increase their disaster vulnerability and climate-related risk. These features include their small physical size, growing populations, susceptibility to weather-related hazards, exposure to external shocks, and stresses due to their dependence on foreign assistance and openness of their economies, and of other different features as well, relative remoteness, fragile environments. And so all these different characteristics shape small island states' capabilities in mitigating and adapting to climate-related vulnerabilities and sea level change. My particular entry focused kind of on two parts. The first major part of the encyclopedia entry looks at adaptation and mitigation efforts across these three regions. I briefly shared examples of climate action efforts by nations. And so I highlighted some regional entities as well that focused on climate risk management and various efforts. So for an example, from the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea region, I highlighted a particular document, the Climate Change Policy Framework document by the country of Maldives, looking at the different 8 guiding principles to approach climate change. What was included in the document is looking at climate leadership, intergenerational equity, mainstream climate change, multilateral partnerships, et cetera. In the Caribbean, I focused on various partnerships, particularly coming from different research institutions. So I highlighted an example of Puerto Rico. While it's a US territory and it's not a part of CARICOM, which is this national island national body in the Caribbean. While Puerto Rico is not a part of CARICOM, there are some climate adaptation and mitigation initiatives that Puerto Rico as a US territory can participate. And so there are some opportunities for US Caribbean region, including US Virgin Islands, to foster these partnerships and relationships with Caribbean entities on climate action and disaster risk reduction. From an example, looking at the Pacific region, I looked at Pacific leadership and looking at various different entities that shape regional strategic frameworks that address the impacts of climate change and disaster. So for an example, the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program and also the Pacific Island Foreign Leaders, that those different entities, right, looks at ways in which to implement adaptation measures and assist island states in looking at sustainable resources. And so I will say that, this entry doesn't, extensively review or evaluate the efficacy of risk reduction strategies developed by these different island states. Instead, it just spotlights a few publicly accessible national policies, federal plans, and intergovernmental initiatives pursued across these 3 geographic regions. Because one, I think learning about island nation disaster management and climate efforts provide a baseline awareness of existing strategies and initiatives. And also it helps us really think about the context of our research and our scholarship if we are looking at small island nations and looking at their ongoing efforts. So helping us think through our own, having more informed analysis and interpretations of various concepts and experiences. And I also think it's important when we understand these different federal and partnerships of small island nations, it helps us to identify what actions and collaborations that currently exist and may be implemented in the future. And so these different partnerships can help us engage with relevant stakeholders and consider what, initiatives and resources that may be promised for future implementation. And I also think that, we can anticipate once we have a baseline understanding of what's going on in small island nations or other nations around the world, right? We can kind of anticipate these different emerging policy trends and interventions to enhance resilience and sustainability in small island communities. I ended this entry looking at how do we, move forward with different discussions on climate actions of small island nations and how researchers, academics, students, practitioners may think about various themes as it relates to small island nations. And I focused on 4. So I ended my entry looking at 4 different policy and research challenges or considerations. The first one looking at how do we understand differences and similarities in disaster and climate impacts. And so, thinking about ways to engage more in terms of climate risk and vulnerabilities and inequalities. And also, how do we capture this data? How do we think about the periodic data, thinking about the longevity of different data sets that we have, and also just recognizing that these climate impacts have various local and regional impacts, and thinking through, these different targeted ways of risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, and inequalities. The second policy challenges in the entry is looking at culture, migration, and climate diasporas, and just overall thinking about, if we think about climate change, how would that impact small island states, cultural landscapes, and identity? How do we think about these different ways in terms of climate-induced migration and resettlement? The third one, coalition building and interregional partnerships. What does that look like? How do we engage in these different relationships? And the fourth one is looking at targeted funding that includes loss and damage, different type of financing. And so, yeah, these are kind of the different topics that I ended off with. And so if you have any questions, please let me know and I'll turn it back to Dan.
Great, thank you, Crystal. I think an interesting part of this encyclopedia is the range of topics covered, including several case studies, of which the case study by Crystal of small island states is one. There are also case studies of California, Texas, Brazil, China, the United States, and so on. So I think that adds a dimension. So I next would like to ask Todd Eisenstadt, a fellow editor and of the Encyclopedia. But Todd is a professor of government in the School of Public Affairs at American University and the research director of the Center for Environmental Policy. So Todd, some concluding comments, and remember, any other questions, we have some now. Please put them into the Q&A function. Todd.
Many thanks, Dan, and thanks for your leadership in this project, and thanks to the other to Manjo and to all of the authors, as well as also to Alexander Grant, who did a good deal of work on this project. So thanks to all of you. I would just throw in a few comments just to say briefly, that the first several presentations talked about political actors and the importance of political leaders, corporations, and the private sector, and also the incentives facing individuals psychologically in how we address our own views of climate and what we need to do to assist in managing climate change. I think that then we heard about at least one of the policy areas, the Border Adjustment Acts, and we also heard about the importance in the last presentation of adaptation and of how that affects nations and the I think the unequal distribution of vulnerability and how countries go about, and groups of people within countries go about addressing these vulnerabilities. I think these are all very important themes that the encyclopedia covers. And I think in general, the encyclopedia does a very good job of addressing just sort of 90 topical areas. But I just want to sort of, I think, make three comments that are important as a complement to the discussion of the encyclopedia, which is more for pedagogical use, and it goes deeply into the topics that we selected, which were topics that we thought were of great importance and perhaps not fully explained in an easy to access way elsewhere. I think the comments are that, if the iceberg is sort of looking at climate change as one huge concept, then we need to consider a lot of the conceptual parts of this iceberg, but also that what we're mostly seeing, especially on the mitigation area, which is perhaps, the cause of emissions, we're mostly seeing impacts discussed, and I think it's time to go further into the causes, which are mainly decarbonization, right? And the use of carbon and the use of fossil fuels. And we need to figure out how to decarbonize economies. This is where the action is. And as one of the speakers, Terry Yossi, said, the interesting ride has just begun. I just want to say, and highlight that the interesting ride is really about three countries which have over half the emissions: China, India, and the US, which are, in terms of emissions per year, those are the economies that are producing the greatest emissions. And that in the sectors of energy and industry and transportation, with other sectors as well. But those are really where we need to focus our attention, and we need to apply these concepts in a way that helps us move in those directions. So I think the first comment is that we need to look at really the low-hanging fruit in mitigation. How do we reduce emissions quickly and efficiently? And part of the answer is decarbonizing the economy worldwide. And so the concepts in the encyclopedia are useful in addressing that question. The encyclopedia is broken out, as encyclopedias need to be, concept by concept. So I'm trying to bring some of the concepts together into sort of their overarching frame that I think we need. I think another comment for sort of an overarching claim is one that Crystal Falima brought out extensively in her presentation, which is that adaptation is increasingly part of the climate story, which, when we first became widely aware of climate change in the 1980s and 90s, it was mostly about mitigation. Adaptation became a more important portion of the discussion, and is increasingly so, especially with the new declarations at the last conference of the parties meeting by the UN about loss and damage, and how important that is to considering the equity of giving countries tools to address and face climate vulnerability. Adaptation is increasingly key. And as Professor Falima said, we need to be able to assess programs better, to have baseline understandings of how programs and proposed policies can reduce people's sense of vulnerability, and thus improve adaptation to climate change. And that we need to be able to more effectively consider the impacts of policy instruments on the most vulnerable people, but also, of course, on everyone else as well. So the second, I think, point to make is that several of the encyclopedia entries relate to adaptation, probably about a quarter of them. And those need to also be considered in this broader frame of getting greater accountability in understanding how to help adapt. Okay, so that's a second point. I think a third point is just a broader point for all of us, which is that, we're not doing enough. The climate is getting warmer. 2023 was yet again the warmest year on recorded history. The recording started in the middle of the 19th century. And so we have had climate change warming of over 1 degree Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution already. We're trying to keep it by the end of this century to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is several degrees Fahrenheit. The UN is not sure, and the climate modelers at the United Nations are not sure we're going to make that target. In fact, it's likely that we won't. But now we're shooting for a 2 degrees Celsius hop on the climate warming. It's a ceiling on climate change. We want to only warm the planet 2 degrees Celsius from about 1850 to the present, and we want it 2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So we're still not there. Now, this encyclopedia and efforts like it, I think, are a start in helping us to get the concepts down to enable us to make draw broader conclusions and reach a greater understanding about the tools we need to employ in order to get where we need to be. So I thank again the contributors and the other editors to the project, and all of those of you who are watching the presentation today. We encourage you to, to use this tool, to use this text, but put it into action. So whether that is in your teaching, in your analysis, in your as an activist, however you do it, let's all move this forward. So thank you, and I turn it back to Dan.
Thank you, Todd. Some inspiring words. I always tell students that as a result of the international efforts, we're better off than we would have been, but we're well short of where we should be. And I think that is a short assessment. And certainly this is a major public policy challenge. So we have some questions. We have about 9 minutes left in the program. The first question, and this came after our first 3 chapter presentations, so we can consider it more broadly. But let me just ask if everybody could come back on, cameras on for any questions, and you can all jump in as you see fit. The question is, are there examples of how positive psychology, populism, and corporate action have benefited climate action? So I will pose that, but then I'll also invite others to come in on that. So any thoughts on positive psychology, populism, and corporate action, to the extent to which that has benefited climate action?
So I can give an example from positive psychology. There are many examples, mainly regarding behavior, individual behavior. For instance, in local authorities where they want to promote second-hand clothing purchases, then you can do it by just making making all the thing more accessible, more fun, and more shops, or creating activities for the local authorities to get for the people together to do something. And a very specific example from the field of demographics, for instance, in many countries where they wanted to promote demographic policies, then they used policies that directly influence the people to have 2 children, to have 2-child families, instead of have less kids because it's dangerous to the environment. They went for women education, children education, fertility clinics. So this is like implementing the direct approach. And the example that I gave in my talk, for instance, of how, if you want to promote policies directly, such as looking at resources rather than menaces. For example, the stormwater, but it was done also in waste in general. So these are some examples.
Yeah.
There are many, many more, but I will let other people answer as well.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to add to that? And we can include beyond the initial 3 topics, how there are examples of actions in the areas of your essay that benefited climate action.
Well, if you wish, I can continue to just some words on. I mean, populism is not too famous to be very positive for climate action. So I would say, I mean, it depends on what kind of level of analysis you have. So if you think just about the rhetoric and the strategy to be disruptive and to be just a climate denialist, there's not much positive thinking in there. But if you think about populism as the kind of logic of the politics in a way that it gives voice to marginalized people, to underrepresented communities, to the famous coal workers, but also coastal communities, etc. I think there's quite some value to broaden the perspective and to point at the social issues of that lay behind certain policies, such as carbon crediting or the RET mechanism and so on. And there's one example I can put you interesting by Teresa Kramatz and Donald Kingsbury that did research on left-wing climate populism in Ecuador and their Yasuni initiative, where they initially wanted to keep oil in the ground for a very populist understanding for the benefit of all, but the initiative failed. But they nicely show how this kind of populist moment is created through this kind of rhetoric and idea. And another example is quite a contested article in this collection, but what was his name? Johan Nordenswart and Markus Ketola compared the rhetoric of Donald Trump and Greta Thunberg. And well, I mean, Greta Thunberg has no kind of direct policy action, but definitely shaped climate politics over the last years and brought to attention justice issues as well as a lot of climate policy issues. So it's rather broad, but you can think about the different levels where populists engage. And as I said, we don't have the kind of institutional framework to engage with populist argumentation and populist claims. So it would be good to think about how to deal with this rather than just neglecting it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And one last topic from one of the attendees. Ilaria and Terry's back-to-back presentations reinforce the issue of regulations and incentives that are placed on business. Do we need businesses who care about social responsibility, or do we simply need governments willing to guide the behavior of the corporate sector? So anyone that would like to comment on that topic, it was addressed specifically to Ilaria and Terry.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think that is a relevant question. I would argue that we need both, certainly, and that they
Yes.
go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you look at the EU approach, you see a proliferation of new instruments. Some just entered into force, some are in the making as we speak, that really try and more than guide, let's say, the behavior of the corporate sector. If you think, for instance, of the due diligence directive, the corporate social sustainability reporting directive, the greenwashing directive. But I would probably say, to go back to this trade and nexus that you also highlighted after my speech, then, that so many of the recent instruments that have been designed by the EU actually are experimenting with this unilateral trade-related measures, and the CBAM is certainly one example, but the recent deforestation-free regulation is also another example. So I'm not sure whether it is the least controversial way to go about guiding the corporate sector's behavior towards greening their value chains, because this is obviously deep effects on the flows of exports to the EU, and is causing many angry governments to react on those measures, but it's certainly the approach of the EU lately.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Terry? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I think we've entered another phase in the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. There is this mythology that has been around for many decades that innovation comes from the private sector. And while that's true in a number of markets, what's also very true is that the private sector tends not to fund some of the basic research, some of the basic building blocks that ultimately led to the internet, that led to pharmaceutical products that were so quickly commercialized during the pandemic, or many other kinds of technologies. And we're seeing that theme of the government as the incubator of big ideas replay itself in terms of decarbonization. So even while ExxonMobil and Chevron will lobby like hell against regulation of greenhouse gases, they have their hand out for subsidies from the government to help create a hydrogen industry. And so, can government commercialize those investments? Probably less successful at doing that than incubating the initial demonstration projects to a point where you can get the scale, where the private sector seems to be more focused on and more capable of taking those concepts and those demonstration projects and moving them to market scale. So I think what makes me somewhat more of an optimist than I would have been several years ago is I think we're seeing emerging some complementarity between what the public sector can do and what the private sector can do. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of lobbying and advocacy, there's a lot of politics and populism in the midst of all that. So I don't know that that complementarity always comes through, at least to citizens who will be entering voting booths throughout this year in different countries. But that complementarity, I think, is something that gives me some optimism.
Excellent. Okay, I think that's an excellent point to wrap up. Plus, we're about out of time. So I just want to encourage people to take a look at the Elgar Encyclopedia of Climate Policy. Electronic copies are very valuable instruments for using this in classes. I plan to use it in classes in the coming years. So I encourage people to check it out. So thanks very much to all our participants, to our co-editors, to all of our chapter authors, but especially to those of you who spoke today. And thanks to the audience. And certainly climate change will be one of the defining public policy issues of this century. And we hope that we've made a contribution. I think we have. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers. And with that, we will conclude. Thanks.